Welcome to In the Can with Carmella Cann. The big question today is abortion on the ballot in 2024. We took some time to ask some New Yorkers on the street, and this is what their answers were. Hey everyone, I'm on the streets of New York City and I'm finding out whether or not abortion is going to be on people's mind in the presidential 2024 election. Hi ma'am, how are you? Are you an American voter?
Yes, I am.
You are. So you've heard that, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade 2 years ago. Do you think that's on people's minds today in the election presidential for 2024?
If it's not, I hope it is.
Okay, is it on your mind?
It's on my mind, but my position is what it was, which is that we, as women, should have choice. And the fact that it is even in question is bizarre, crazy, retro, I don't know what. So I'm hoping that it will bring women out to vote this election. I hope it will be one of the game changers.
Or not, the issue of abortion will be important to you in the 2024 election.
Definitely. That always has been important to me. I think, unfortunately, that there isn't really anyone to vote for who seems to care about abortion. The Republicans obviously don't. I think if the Democrats did, they would have done more work for us. So it's tough to decide who to vote for. I mean of course, I'm not going to vote for a Republican, but I don't really feel like the Democrats are like protecting our right to abortion either.
Are you a voter?
Yes.
Is it on the ballot for you in 2024?
Yes.
And are you pro-choice or pro-life?
I am pro-choice.
Pro-choice. Do you think that abortion is on the ballot in 2024?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't vote.
You don't vote?
No.
Okay. You don't want to vote?
No.
You're not registered with the party?
I am, but I don't want to vote.
Okay. And as a woman, you don't find this to be an important issue?
It's your choice. Your life.
Got it. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Now we have two great guests today that I like to introduce. First, we have Duane, who's a former New York State Senator and former New York City Councilman. He's also a Democrat. And we also have Sara Thompson, who is an attorney and a registered Democrat as well. So I'm going to ask you, the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade 2 years ago, back in 2022. Is abortion on the ballot in 2024, Tom? Senator?
Absolutely. It's one of the main issues. Not only is it's absolutely a huge issue that many people mention when they talk about what issues are important to them, but anyone who doesn't say it when they're pushed a little bit, it absolutely comes up as an issue. And so even if people are not, it doesn't seem like it's their exact focus. Like if they've already made up their mind about that, and they've already made up their mind about what candidate they're going to vote for based on their position on choice.
Okay. Sara, do you think that this issue still resonates with voters in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a political pundit, but I certainly do think that it is something that is in front of mind for a lot of people, women in particular, but not just women. I mean, abortion rights obviously affect everybody. It's a question of family planning, right? Your ability to control your future, your participation in the workforce. Particularly with young people, right? This is something that a lot of young people have not quite had to confront in their lives. But it's certainly, this is an issue from the 70s and the 60s, right? Women, fighting for the right for abortion. And all of a sudden it's thrust upon a new generation of voters, of young people in particular. And so I agree. I think it is something people care about. And we hope that people show up and turn up to vote, not just with respect to this issue. Obviously, there are a lot of really important issues going on right now, but certainly this is one of them.
I mean, do you think this is more of a state issue with local politicians, or this is a presidential issue for 2024, Senator?
Well, it's absolutely both. First and foremost, if we look at the presidential race, Supreme Court justices die because of age, and sometimes they die just because they die, as in the case of Judge Scalia was unexpected. So who appoints that judge is incredibly important. We know that if, I hate to say his name, ex-President Trump were to be elected, he would put someone incredibly young in, a young right-wing, beyond Federalist Society person who would be there forever. And the court is already conservative. In fact, its entire history is pretty conservative, with liberal common sense moments scattered throughout. So we absolutely need someone who's going to appoint someone. Listen, they don't have to agree with me on everything, but they have to be thoughtful. They have to know the law. They can't think about what the founding fathers were thinking exactly at the time, because that is also ridiculous. But they have to be just. It used to be that Supreme Court justices, when they were being questioned for nominations to see if they could get through the nomination, when they were asked about an issue, they were asked to talk a lot about the issue, not their position on the issue. But those days are gone, and now we find that judges lie about it. They say, for instance, they said 3 of them, at least, maybe 4. Let's see, the 2 predators. Probably believe that. Anyway, they said that Kavanaugh, the new woman who has to ask her husband if she can go to work in the morning, because that's what her bizarre Catholic faith cult says. But anyway, they
Yeah, no,
I'm sputtering at who these people are that got on the Supreme Court because of this horrendous precedent from before, and so I think maybe I should stop for a moment.
I echo that. I can echo that sentiment, because at the end of the day, the Supreme Court is supposed to be, in principle, perhaps apolitical, but we all know that judges are people, and Supreme Court justices are no different. They are people. They carry with them their views, their worldviews, their outlooks on the way things should be in the world, their morality, their ethics. And as a result, the people who we put into these positions, and not just the Supreme Court, we're also talking about a huge federal judiciary that is judges that need to be nominated to the bench to do the hard work of getting these cases, working through the merits of cases before they ever reach the Supreme Court. These positions are incredibly important, and they're impactful on people's lives. And if we don't have a president who is going to make the type of appointments that of individuals who are qualified, and not just, Democrats, right? I'm not suggesting that every federal judge should be a Democrat. I think that there's room and there's space for there to be a wide variety of opinions and ideologies. But you need a person who's responsible. And so to make that decision, right, you need somebody who can actually take a leadership role and appoint people who are smart, qualified individuals to these jobs. And that goes, again, from the district court level all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so in that sense, absolutely, this is a federal election question, right? The presidency is the person who determines that.
Recently, Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos are people too. Several medical providers have hauled FVI treatment. Sara, what are your thoughts there?
In a first-of-its-kind decision, the Alabama Supreme Court has ruled that frozen embryos are children and that a person can be held liable for destroying them. The case involves couples whose embryos were destroyed when a patient removed them from a freezer and accidentally dropped them. The court held that the patient could be held liable in a wrongful death lawsuit. Reproductive rights advocates say the case could have implications for fertility treatments such as IVF and the hundreds of thousands of patients who seek them every year.
So this is a tough question because it actually, I recall my first year of law school doing some sort of a 50-state survey for my tort professor who on the issue of wrongful death statutes and the issue of fetal personhood, which is the issue that you're referring to in Alabama, came up in the context of wrongful death. And I have to caveat this, that this is the case in Alabama, right? The statute, the issue arose out of a lawsuit for the wrongful death of embryos that the couple who created the embryos wanted, right? They wanted those babies. They want babies in quotes. They wanted the opportunity to implant those embryos at some point in the future. And so when they were destroyed by this individual who apparently broke into the facility, that was damaging for them, right? And so there is this difference between in the wrongful death context, where you have a wanted embryo, and the abortion context. So I think that's an important distinction to lay out there. I don't have the answer for how the law should work those distinct issues. I think that it is certainly within the creativity of the lawyers and the judiciary to come up with rules that take into account the wantedness of the embryo. But as a general proposition, I don't think that it is. I think it's going to have tremendous political backlash and also just social harm for people who are wanting to do IVF procedures if, in fact, the result of the Supreme Court's ruling in this particular wrongful death suit has the widespread impact that people are anticipating it will have outside of the area of wrongful death, right? Just because the embryos have been deemed persons within the wrongful death statute does not necessarily mean that they'll be deemed persons in all other contexts, right? So there is, again, that distinction to be made, and I think it still remains to be seen, even in Alabama, how that's going to play out.
I mean, right now, states like Oklahoma want to charge mothers and doctors for murder if they do an abortion. I mean, what are your thoughts, Sarah, on, some of these states have very hardcore policies around it?
I mean, look, I'm obviously opposed to these sort of draconian laws that would, criminalize or even, levy, civil penalty for people who perform abortions or who obtain abortions. I think that the reality on the ground is much more complicated and complex than many of these legislators care to, recognize. And at the end of the day, whether or not you believe that a person has the right or should have the right to choose an abortion, or stated differently, to avoid the intense responsibility that is becoming apparent, whether or not you believe that's true, it may, again, I think Tom said this at the top of the hour, it's not really up to you, right? There's a lot of other different worldviews and viewpoints on this issue. And I think that the states that are passing these types of laws, or there were trigger laws, like they were already in effect, and they just happened to sort of be curtailed by Roe v. Wade, in the 70s, and they just, once Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2021, they went back into effect, essentially. So what you're dealing with in actuality are statutes that have been on the books since, the early 19th century, mid-19th century, and that on its face should raise questions for people, right? I mean, before women even had the right to vote, before women were even full persons.
But they couldn't have property. They, if they got married, it meant their husband owned everything. And by the way, in those days, you couldn't vote unless you owned property. I mean, there were a lot of, it was a different world. And I want to try to so I'm not an attorney, so now I'm going to just try to simplify it from a non-attorney point of view. What we're really talking about is regulating women's bodies. And there is no part of a man's body that we regulate. I can't think of anything that is regulated as part. So why are we doing anything to regulate what a woman does with her body? Because it is her body, and government should absolutely stay out of it. I mean, I think there should be no laws. I don't know why government is involved at all. I even think Roe v. Wade is too restrictive. I have never. Maybe there's one millionth of 1%, or oh my God, 1/100th of 1% of women who are careless or something about it, but the to a person, every woman who's had an abortion has been thoughtful about it and has done it for reasons that are incredibly important, whether it's what's called late term, which is not the right term for it all. It means that the baby's going to be born and suffer for a few hours if it's even born alive and die, and it could affect the mother's ability to have more children, or whether someone decides to have an abortion in the very early stages of a pregnancy. This is none of anyone's business. The only laws on the book should be if someone is harming someone. If someone is harming a woman, that is a problem. But it's not if someone is harming the fetus. We have to look at this.
But there are many pro-lifers that believe that the fetus is a person and therefore, feel as though they're protecting that person because that person cannot speak for themselves. So
when do they start speaking?
And a lot of this, of course, is
it's a fetus. It's not it can't survive on its own. It is part of. See, again, we're talking about the fetus. Let's talk about the mother, but it's the mother that's like in control of whether or not how far along this fetus gets to go. It's no one else's business. There is no place in American law, in biblical law, that says what the exact moment of personhoodshipness is. I mean, listen, it's just beyond the pale. And by the way, there's some interesting things about this. The Catholic Church, the other ones are so crazed about this. But it used to be they didn't really care that much at all. It's a very Protestant thing, and something that Catholics sort of latched onto it. It's something that ebbs and flows. But what it really is, no matter what, it's the level to which we want to regulate women's lives. That is what it is. We should absolutely always be looking at it from what impact does this have on a citizen who happens to be a cisgender woman.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask a personal question of both of you just because I'm about to move into another topic. Do you identify either one of you with a specific religion or consider yourself Christian at all?
I've taught high school classes and I've taught college classes, and we do a class on whether or not religion has any place in politics or government or public policy. And, of course, they all say, absolutely not. Religion, there should be no place at all. And I said, really? No soup kitchens? Holy Apostles and Episcopal Church, we can't give them any money for their soup kitchen? Well, okay, so what I'm saying is really that you cannot help but to bring the values that you were brought up with to the table when you're deciding policy. You might be impacted in some cases and go against whatever it was that you were brought up with. But generally, the sort of vast majority of people come through adolescence into adulthood with sort of a moral compass that has been developed by the environment in which they grew up, and from being a child living at home through whatever their experiences have been at school and their friends, they bring it with them. And so I was raised Roman Catholic. I am not the poster child. Have I sometimes go? Yes. I do sometimes go, but I'm more of a sermon junkie. Like if there's a priest that's giving good sermons, I will follow them around for all. But if not, then I'll go to the CBST, the gay synagogue, and listen to the rabbi's drosh because I'm a sucker for that too. Like that's really there's something comforting about going because I was brought up with it. They're sitting there, the ritual. We like rituals. Now, also, I think that I think I'll go out that way. If you know what I mean. I think I'll have there'll be a funeral for me in a church, whether I like it or not. I think that's just what's going to happen, because for a whole host of reasons, people tend to go out the way that they came in. But I am not going to be buried in a Catholic cemetery. I know, I've already sort of make arrangements for that not to happen. But so all of this is to say, I'm babbling on and on about it.
Do you consider yourself Christian or not? That's the question.
I identify with sort of the liberation theology of
Okay,
Christianity.
okay.
Let's say that. Boy,
Sarah-
you really pushed me on that one.
How about you? Do you identify as Christian or not?
No.
Okay.
I grew up in a relatively religious household, Southern Baptist. Experienced various different religions through friends and school, but I do not practice. I do not have a faith.
Okay. What do you say to those politicians that say that the nation was founded on Christianity and want to infringe their religious views on others? Senator, what are your thoughts there?
It wasn't founded on Christianity, and although, truth be told, that there was discrimination against Jewish people in the early days, certainly in colonial times, but I think even in the beginning of our republic. But there is a lot of, not a lot, but there's, in God we trust. I think that, does the Declaration of Independence say something Godish? I can't remember. But God is mentioned here and there.
There are politicians like Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, and other people on the Republican side that said that Christianity should be part of our politics and policy, that they want to govern based on their religious views, or that's part of their compass. I know that former Vice President
Pence.
Pence.
He hated this Alabama law. He was in favor of very
because I think he had IVF.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
Right.
So,
I mean, look, I'm also not an historian, so I'm not going to get too deep in the woods on whether or not this country was founded upon Christianity. What I would say though to the people who make that argument is the following: let's assume that that's accurate, right? But it doesn't. What's important, though, to remember is that people who founded this country, who fled England, were fleeing tyranny. They were fleeing oppression, and part of that oppression included religious persecution. So it is absolutely part and parcel of the foundation, the blood of this country, to have some level of freedom from religious oppression. And because we now, fast forwarding to present day, and have for decades at this point, considered ourselves a pluralistic society, it is the only way that type of society, which I believe is a good one, is arguably the best way to have a society structured is through a plurality of ideas and ethics and ideologies, is that you have to acknowledge then that there is a space for everyone's view up to a point, right? People like to talk about, the First Amendment, I have the right to say whatever I want. Well, actually you don't. And there are very clear examples of when your right to say what you want is curtailed by the government, right? So this idea that, we're a Christian nation and so Christian ideals have to prevail is, frankly, I think it's an unfair evaluation of our history, but it's also just not tenable given that we're a nation of plural values.
And their Christianity, by the way, included permitting slavery. So
well, there's that.
I mean,
and a whole host of other.
I'm totally for
right?
separation of religion and state. I definitely don't want other people's ideology to infringe on my rights.
But let Mike Johnson have his. But he completely misunderstands his job if he thinks that God has told him to impose what he thinks God thinks on the rest of the House of Representatives and therefore the rest of the nation. It's just, on the face of it, it's absurd. But he gets elected, and he was apparently agreeable enough to the Republicans that they put him there. But just on the face of it, that he believes that it's very much like, the president, the ex-president, has a video out about how God sent Donald Trump to this nation to save us. It's that kind of thing. Mike Johnson's Christianity doesn't believe in global warming. I mean,
that's another conversation.
No, but I mean, the list goes on and on and on of things that that are that there were things that were founded on in the the 1700s, the late 1700s, that we know a lot more now, and we know a lot more every day than they probably do every year from then. In fact, free speech was just a huge case, and who knows how the court is going to decide on social media, whether it has the same, whether it's the press or whether it's privately owned, they can do whatever they want. Or there's a whole host of cauldron of issues. And by the way, you could talk a lot more trash about me, because even though I'm a former elected official, but especially when I was an elected official, then about you. You could say,
as a public figure,
then
you have
just throw it at me.
You're more, same here. You can talk about, but I do want to move on because we are on a time. Sara, can you break down how do we get here in terms of even having this conversation? Like, obviously, the Supreme Court overturn Roe versus Wade. I mean, how did that happen? And if you give us the short version, how do we get here that we're having this conversation right now?
So Norma McCorvey is Jane Roe, as we all know her. Remains the subject of several very interesting documentaries and published pieces in the Atlantic, the New Yorker. Well documented about her history. The history, her potted history, I guess, is she was born in the 40s. She was the product of a very of a broken household. Right, her father abandoned the family early on in her childhood. She her mother was an alcoholic, as far as I understand it. Exposed to a lot of violence, a lot of tumult in her adolescence. Eventually wound up in Texas with her mother. She ended up pregnant at the age of 18, ended up having that child, put it up for adoption. I think her mother actually ended up adopting the child, and through a series of sort of self-exploration, perhaps some drug use, as I'm led to believe, she had some battles with her own sexuality. At the very least, she was bisexual. She certainly had sexual relationships with men. She bore 3 children by men, but she also had long-term relationships, serious relationships with women that she was exploring after the first child. She became pregnant again for a second time. She gave that child up for adoption as well, and within, I believe, a year or so, she wound up pregnant for a third time. So
I mean, my thing is obviously the Supreme Court at the time ruled in favor of abortion, and now here in 2022, the justices changed. Like, what was the change?
The change. So the third pregnancy of Norma was the baby Roe, we'll call her. Not to be derogatory, she's obviously a human being. She's alive today. She was born during the pendency of the lawsuit. The lawsuit was filed in 1970, in March, I believe, and she was born a few months later. And the issue, the core issue at stake in Roe was the question of, and it had never been presented to the court in this way, was whether or not there was a fundamental right to abortion, where does the fundamental right come from? The Constitution doesn't speak of this type of right. So where does this sort of idea about, I have a right to an abortion? It comes from this notion of privacy. And privacy, the idea of privacy, again, is not specifically talked about in the Constitution, but there are various provisions that allude to it. And there were a series of cases decided by the Supreme Court prior to Roe, which created this sort of doctrine that we like to call, that in the legal world is called substantive due process. And it arises out of, it's this notion of privacy that the 14th Amendment protects people from state intrusion into their lives in various aspects that we might consider private. Things like marriage, contraception, interracial marriage, the language you choose to educate your children in. Those types of cases all predated Roe. And so by the time Roe got in front of the court, and this question of whether or not the state had a right to impose restrictions on a woman's decision to have a child, the court was sort of primed to understand this issue in terms of privacy, and specifically a violation of a woman's privacy as between her and her physician. And so the court essentially held that there was such a right, that right did exist within the similarly to how it had existed in those other cases that I just mentioned. And they came down on the side of, yes, women have an interest, a privacy interest in what happens to their bodies, the idea of what to choose or what not to choose, that the state should not be interfering with. And there were caveats, right? It wasn't that the state just had to step back and say, we do nothing, right? There were, as the pregnancy became, inch closer to viability, the state had a greater interest in protecting the potentiality of life, is the way the court put it. And I think that potentiality of life is sort of what we have been alluding to in the prior conversation about, what's the value of these issues present day. And certainly the religious
so what
conservative
changed
movement.
with the Supreme Court that now all of a sudden you had justices that
I wanted to just
Sure.
I know that the notorious RGB, she would have preferred another case go before the court. She wasn't there at the time, but it had more to do with equal protection under the law and men and women being treated equally in the military, I believe. So while it wasn't explicitly talked about, they found a way to do it through the right to privacy, but there was some cognizance that men and women were being treated differently. In fact, the men on the Supreme Court, they had a very poor understanding of women's reproductive I was going to say system. That's not really the right word. I mean, they really, but they were so ill-informed about what happens with a woman's body. But I think what's happened is that we're going backwards with this into really making women second-class citizens by regulating them, and that's, I think, what's changed. That's become okay.
Right. That gets to the core of your question, which is, in the ensuing years. So, 20 years later, after Roe was decided, there's another case comes before the Supreme Court, and that case is Planned Parenthood v. Casey. It's another case that was effectively overruled by the Dobbs decision in 2021. And what Casey did was it shifted the analysis a little bit. It shifted the standard. In law, we have standards by which the laws they either survive or they fail, right? In the case of a constitutional challenge to a law, what the courts are looking for is whether or not it infringes upon some sort of in this case, a fundamental, quote, fundamental right, or some other right that's protected like speech or association or something like that. And the test that was set out in Roe was quite stringent. Later on in the 90s, in the Casey case, the standard was relaxed a little bit so that states were permitted then to impose some restrictions to address issues, the life of the protection of the mother, right? Should you be allowed to have abortions in a clinic, or should you be allowed to do them from your bedroom, right? There were various issues that kept coming up, and the Casey case addresses some of those issues and shifts the burden slightly to this sort of undue burden test, whereby the state can regulate as long as it doesn't pose an undue burden on the woman's ability to obtain an abortion. And various restrictions cropped up over the years in light of Casey. Jumping to Dobbs. What we have in Dobbs is a shift in the court. It should be no surprise that when the court, the makeup of the court, now we have sort of the conservative supermajority on the court. As I mentioned at the top, these are they try not to be political. Justice Alito, in his majority opinion, throws his hands up and says, "Oh, we're an apolitical body," but they're not apolitical. We all know that, and I don't necessarily think that we should strive for that. But what happened is that the court basically says in this new makeup, the majority of the court, I should say, shifts its position and says, look, this is a very hot political issue, and we don't think that it is for judges to decide whether or not this right exists. There is no constitutional provision allowing for this type of privacy right. And the court says, we're not gonna keep going down this road. Roe was wrong when it was decided. Casey was wrong when it affirmed Roe, and we're going to start a new page in this book about privacy and this so-called substantive privacy, substantive due process, the whole thing. And so instead of dealing with the law, the Mississippi law that was at issue, and before the court said, which by the way, just briefly, was a restriction, a 15-week restriction on abortion. So it was it was a little bit more drastic than others, but it was more or less a 15-week, post 15 weeks, it was a ban, and with the exception of, rape, incest, life of the mother. And the court said, no, we're going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just don't like Roe. We don't like Casey. So it's gone. It's done.
Leading up to my next question, and I have two questions I do want to ask you to address them pretty quickly. There's been calls saying that the court is political now, and this cannot be good for our country when we start saying that we don't trust our Supreme Court. I mean, Senator, what are your thoughts? Do you think the court is political, or it's just that Democrats don't like the policy that was taken on?
Last year, the United States Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, a ruling that had guaranteed the nationwide right to abortion. In the half-century the ruling stood, there was never a majority of Americans in favor of overturning it. Many in the U.S. saw the move as political, especially after it was made possible by the decision of 3 justices appointed by Donald Trump. Public trust in the court is now at its lowest level in decades, and that's an image problem that could test the United States' democratic institutions.
No, the court is definitely political. It has always been political. People bring their political views to the table. It's how they then use those views when they're interpreting the law. Not only is this Supreme Court conservative and bends and twists the law and creates a different standard of law that has now made it so that all these draconian state laws are popping into effect, but we also know that they have been taking trips paid for by very wealthy Republican contributors, and Clarence Thomas's wife gets paid a tremendous amount of money working for groups that are incredibly, from my point of view, anti-democratic small d, that made up of people, election deniers. And even John Roberts' wife makes a tremendous amount of money placing attorneys in law firms around the country. And how does she have connections to all of these law firms? Because her husband is a Supreme Court judge. Now, where is the line? I don't know. They allegedly have some sort of ethical code, but they can't even. They are even unable to figure out how it was that the Alito decision was publicly released way before the decision actually was made publicly, and so this is a very broken Supreme Court in my. So I can live with a conservative with a thoughtful conservative Supreme Court. I cannot live with an ideologically set in its ways Supreme Court with people. Two of whose members are, from my point of view, sexual predators running the show. It's absolutely not the way it was supposed to be.
It's to me that my concern is less that the court is made up of political appointees, right? As we said, it's less that I don't really care so much that they have political viewpoints of their own. They can certainly walk into a ballot box and vote how they want. That's not my principal concern. But I do join the senators, this sense that there needs to be trust in institutions. And so I struggle myself as a practitioner of the law. I struggle to reconcile these things. And I want to have a Supreme Court that people have trust and faith in, as not as necessarily apolitical as the goal, but as thoughtful and deliberative. A deliberative body. And right now, what I think we have are a handful of individuals who meet that standard, and a handful of individuals who really are too. There's too much potential for their influence, by vis-a-vis political donors and this kind of thing, that we should care about that. And we should all collectively, regardless of your political viewpoints, care that the people who we put in this position of power, they're transparent, their transactions are transparent, and we know where their positions are.
I want to say there was something terrible. They really threw up their hands and said, well, we don't really like abortion. I'm simplifying it, but let's let the states decide. And they really, I'm sure they thought through what that was going to do to this country.
They certainly did think through it. I mean, there's just read Clarence Thomas's dissent, and you'll see that he did think through it.
Exactly,
but he just doesn't care.
I'm glad you both brought up Thomas, because one of the things he wrote in his concurrent opinion was this right of privacy and how this can affect gay marriage as well, because isn't gay marriage also held on the same rights that abortion was held on?
That's right. And I had mentioned before, there were several cases predating Roe, which Roe was predicated on. Those were sort of the substantive due process cases, the right to privacy cases, cases that had found within the 14th Amendment and other places as well, the right to privacy. And then post-Roe, there were several cases as well that, and Obergefell is one of them, Lawrence is another, which both deal with LGBTQ rights. And those are explicitly founded on the same principle of privacy. And so for Thomas to suggest, if in fact that's what he does, that the majority opinion in Dobbs will or should have no effect on anything but abortion is garbage. That's just not how the law works, right? He's in my view, what he's doing is sort of shopping for cases, right? And very, not for nothing, the one case that Justice Thomas omits from that list of cases that he cites as not being affected is Loving v. Virginia, which is the case that allows interracial marriage as a privacy issue. And, you mentioned before the equal protection argument. There have, some of these cases have been, there were arguments made and potential for the court to have decided these cases on different grounds, right? There's not just one way to decide a case. It could be because of the statute says this or the statute says that. And the court reasons, these things separate or together lead us to this conclusion. And so there were arguments made in most of these cases, in some of these cases, I should say, on equal protection grounds, right? You have to uphold or strike down this statute because the equal protection of laws is required, and this statute doesn't meet it. Well, but ultimately, those cases were due process cases. So even if equal protection was argued, the actual holding was due process and privacy. And so for the court to now say, or suggest, Thomas rather, to suggest that those cases are safe from attack, nobody should believe that for a minute. And everybody, again, going back to your original question about whether this issue is on the ballot, it is on the ballot because as states now have the right to decide how these issues, whether it's fetal personhood or whether it's contraception or whether it's, marriage, this issue is here now, and it was foisted upon us by this.
And now there's this.
I just have a point of information. So post Roe, there was, I'm just forgetting the name of the case of the two men in Georgia that were having sex and they were criminally charged with sodomy, and the court ruled that they didn't have the right to privacy. So even after Roe, the right to privacy did not necessarily protect gay people. So even though it wasn't enforced in most states did have anti-sodomy statutes on the books. And in Georgia, I can't remember the name of the case, but it was terrible. They ruled that these two guys were criminally liable for having sex with each other in the privacy of one of their homes. So,
and look, privacy. The question of privacy has not always inured to the benefit of LGBTQ or women in particular, right? Privacy laws were the guise of privacy was what kept until the 70s in some states marital rape laws off the books, right? It wasn't a crime to rape your wife in a lot of jurisdictions until very late, and the reason, because that's a private issue, right? We don't get involved in people's home lives, right? You can beat your children. That's a privacy issue, right? So I'm not here to suggest that privacy is the panacea.
I wasn't saying. I was just sort of the inconsistency. That's
But
why
that's
the
the point,
RBG
right.
didn't like that. That wasn't her favorite case for
Sure.
because it's
and she would have argued it differently. Equal protection, correct? Yeah.
and I guess the thing was he. Through all these years, and he was, even during conservative positions, he would be writing his own little positions. And if you go back and look at them, people at the time would say, these are absurdly conservative. But they're actually, those decisions are now coming true. So he's, as with the former President Trump, you should believe what he says. With Clarence Thompson, yes, he purposely put those things in about interracial marriages, okay, but
Gay marriage is not.
Well,
I mean, I'm glad you.
Potentially, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So he's a clever.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing up Trump because that's leading to my next question. Trump's position on pro-choice and abortion has changed over the years. Many years ago, he was pro-choice. Now that he's a presidential candidate for the Republican Party, he's taken a pro-life position. Recently, he has said
Well, he's taking an anti-abortion position.
Anti-abortion?
Right, yeah.
But I mean, he's being strategic because he's not saying no abortion. I think recently it was said that he's okay up to 16 weeks for an abortion, and also in the case of rape or in the case of the mother.
Life of the mother. Mm-hmm.
Life of the mother. I mean, do you think that's a reasonable position? Because I would say most Americans are moderate and probably don't believe in late-term abortion. I mean, what are your thoughts on his position now on abortion in terms of the 16-week? Senator, why don't you?
No, I just was objecting to the term late-term abortion. I mean, it's
most people
an
probably
anti-choice
are not.
fantasy that no woman just in the 8th month of her pregnancy says, "Oh, I've changed my mind." That just doesn't happen. It's only because of dire consequences that if the pregnancy is not terminated, that a woman makes that heart-wrenching decision.
If that's the case, then the 16-week mark is not a bad thing.
No, it is a terrible thing. No, I'm saying.
I mean, why is it terrible if you think most women don't use that past the 16-week most of the time?
So why are you legislating about something that is not reality? That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to regulate women's bodies based on that they can't take care of themselves about what to do when they get pregnant. Women are not cis women are not they're not children. They make autonomous good decisions for themselves, for their families, for their future, for the future of their family, the future of their children. They're not, under no circumstances, 1/1,000,000% would any woman ever be counted. There are always really substantially well-founded reasons why a woman would have an abortion. By the way, I don't believe there's a woman out there who's had an abortion who doesn't think about it all the time, because it was a huge decision that woman made. And I think everyone would be shocked at the number of women that have had abortions. I feel like every woman, whether they've had an abortion or not, should wear a button that says, "I've had an abortion." Every man should wear a button that says, "I know a woman who's had an abortion," because the fact is, every man does know a woman who's had an abortion, and every woman knows a woman who's had an abortion, and many, many, many women have had abortions, many, many more than say it.
And Sarah, do you want to add to
Yeah,
that?
I mean, I think you're right in pointing out that most Americans take a much more measured position on abortion. I think that when you actually think, right? Look, my mom I love her. We have a great relationship, but she is also an evangelical voter from Oklahoma. And she, she will vote for Donald Trump again. And she and I have vastly different views on politics and what constitutes morality and lots of different things. But what I will say is that even when I speak to my mother about the issue of abortion, she is someone who understands, I believe, that these situations do not occur in a vacuum, right? A woman and they're playing out on the ground right now. And all people need to do to inform themselves is go online to places where you don't normally go, talk to people who you don't normally talk to about their experiences. And what the reality is that, as you pointed out, most abortions happen in the first trimester, and that's great. But there are a lot of the heart-wrenching stories that are happening now in a post-Dobbs society, post-Roe society, I should say, there's this ambiguity about whether or not I'm a doctor, I'm going to be sued, or I'm going to go to prison because I have this patient who is going to become septic if I don't give her an abortion. I mean, that's what's happening. That's what's at stake. So while I agree with the senator that, just full stop, this should be a woman's decision, this should not be something the state interferes with, to me, the real soul of this issue, the guts of it, is not this generic notion of abortion. It's what's happening to people's lives. How are their lives being destroyed? Because now there's a ban in wherever that says, well, you can't do an abortion even to save the mother's life. Or it's, you can do an abortion if it's necessary. Well, what does necessary mean? Right.
No, I agree. I think that, we're getting too far where now there's bans on contraceptives.
That is the ultimate goal. It's a very anti-sex.
And it's like, I'm sure Republicans have sex for a good time and not just for conceivement. So, this whole idea that, we even can't use contraceptives is crazy. But we could go on and on about this topic. And
we all have a past. There might even be a Republican or two in my past. I'm
exactly. Not saying. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Sara.
Yes, thank you for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, audience. And again, is abortion on the ballot for you in 2024, whether it's in your state or on the presidential ballot? Thanks for watching today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also, please leave me a comment on my YouTube channel and tell me what you think of this topic. And also what topics you may want me to cover in the future. All right. Thank you and have a great day.